Hello, everybody. Welcome to this next in the series of our Resilient Lincolnshire Executive Education webinars. My name's Elaine Clark. I'm the College Director of Education and Students here at Lincoln International Business School. And I'm going to be talking to you today about creative thinking in organisations and whether we're using that to help maximise our resilience. Now, I'd very much like you to participate throughout the webinar. On the odd occasion, I'll ask you to specifically post something in the comments, but please feel free to post your comments throughout, and I'll pause occasionally and we'll have a look what's going on in the comment box, and I'll address those at the time if it's appropriate, or we'll save them till the end. But I do want it to be as interactive as possible. Okay, so let's get going, and let me share my screen with you. Okay, so this is our question for today. Are we maximising our resilience through creative thinking in our organisation? So over the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to have a quick look at the growing importance of creativity and its relationship to resilience. And then I'm going to go into a little bit of the research that we did with colleagues at Aston Business School on practitioners' interpretations of creativity, how it's recognised, encouraged, rewarded, and then look at a few themes from that in a little bit more detail as to how we can actually embrace creative thinking so that we can strengthen our organisations for the future. So first of all, looking at the growing importance of creativity, you may be aware that there have been a number of global surveys. They've been going for a number of years, and some of them are repeated annually, some of them every couple of years. But some of the better known, for example, the World Economic Forum regularly does a Future of Jobs report. And the one that seemed to shake people the most was the one that looked at the difference between 2015 and 2020. Now, that report actually came out in about 2016, but what that showed was how creativity had rocketed up the top 10 to third place from 10th place in employers' perception of creativity, and it's important for the future. So here we are in 2020. So creativity, according to what people were thinking 4 or 5 years ago, is absolutely more important. There's also been a McKinsey report in the last couple of years that looks at how people will be spending their time in the future in work. And that again shows a stark difference between the time that will be spent on what we might call manual or lower order skills, and the time that will be spent on higher order skills. And among higher order skills are things such as initiative, creativity, leadership, etc. And the one that I wanted to specifically show you today was by QS. Now, this was a global survey with about 11,000 respondents worldwide, as I say, global. And the difference is what it did was look at what practitioners, employers are saying they need in the future, and whether they feel they are actually getting it from the workforce that is coming through. And that's what this slide shows. The figures in the right-hand column are actually the percentage difference in how important practitioners feel something is for the future, and whether they think they are getting it in the workforce coming through. So problem solving and resilience, for example, there is a 29% difference between how important they think it is and whether they're getting it, i.e. they're not getting it as much as they feel it is important. And if we look at creativity, it comes 7th down the list in terms of their level of satisfaction with how much they're seeing it. So, okay, so it's not number one in the problem areas, if you like, but I would say if you look at those 6 skills above it, then actually creative thinking could actually make those skills stronger. So problem solving, resilience, communication, we can bring creativity into all of those. So if you like, it's a skill in itself, and it's a tool for enhancing other skills. So there's a lot of work out there showing how important creativity is. Now, the research that we did, we again targeted working people, not academics, across the globe, and asked them. We wanted to know, firstly, whether they endorsed the views that these other surveys were showing, and we wanted to delve a little bit more into what did they think creativity meant. You know, it might just be a box that they tick on a questionnaire, but in reality, what does it mean? How does it mean people are behaving, and what is actually happening in their organizations? So I'll share bits of that with you as we go through, but the first bit I want to share really just endorses what this first survey says about creativity becoming a more valuable attribute in the workplace. So the green columns are, I've collected together those who strongly agreed, and those are in the green columns. So if you see overall a very strong endorsement of that statement. But this particular graph I've put, divided it across the size of organizations who responded as well. So that's the number of employees in the organizations. So there is a slightly higher agreement from those in very, very small organizations. But across the other sizes of organizations, not a terrible amount of disparity between their views on the importance of creativity. Okay, so I think we'll just pause there, because I suppose, doing what these surveys do, is just looking at creativity as a concept. And it's important that we think, well, what do we understand? What is it made up of? How would we recognize it if we saw it? But if we can just pause for a second, and I'd really welcome your views at this point. Could you just, in the comment box, just blitz a word, 2 words? What is creativity? When we talk about creativity, what does it mean to you? Can you just perhaps, you know, like I say, let's just spend a minute or so just blitzing that and see what people's thoughts are. Okay. Blue sky thinking, lovely. Got blue sky thinking there. Okay, if people are being a little bit shy at the moment, that's absolutely fine. Let me share with you what is the broadly acknowledged interpretation of creativity across the academic literature these days. And this has taken many decades of writing to emerge. But fundamentally, the general agreement now about creativity, that it involves something which is novel, and this is the part that when I ask people, normally this is the part that doesn't usually come up, that it is useful. So tying those things together, that's what creativity is about. Yes, it's about something new, but it is also something that has to be useful, or sometimes we use the phrase task appropriate. So if we bear that in mind, that's what we're talking about when we talk about creativity. So I think sometimes people are possibly a little nervous of the term, because firstly, they think it has to be blindingly novel, whereas when, you know, that's not the interpretation. Just anything that is new from what has been done before, even incremental newness is fine, but also that it has to be applied. Otherwise, it's not genuine creativity. Okay, so that's a quick look at creativity. We'll explore that in more detail in a few minutes. Let's have a quick look at resilience, because we want to tie creativity in with resilience. So organisational resilience is the ability of an organisation to anticipate, prepare for, respond and adapt both to incremental change and sudden disruptions in order so that they can not only survive, but they can prosper as well. So if you look at those verbs used in that definition, so to be resilient, we need to anticipate, which means we need to think about things that aren't already happening, but that might happen. So we need to imagine a future, if you like. We need to prepare for it. So we need to make those decisions about how we prepare for something that might or might not happen while we also carry on with our daily activities. So responding and adapting as well are something that requires behaviour that is different from the behaviour we've exhibited so far. And heaven only knows we've all had an opportunity to experience sudden disruptions in terms of what we've all been through over the last few months. I will say actually that the research we did was prior to the pandemic, so it will be really interesting to know whether you think people's responses would have been different if they'd answered the questionnaire over the last 2 or 3 months. But anyway, it will be interesting to see your thoughts on that. So, for example, there is an organisational resilience index that has about 16 factors on it. So I just picked out a handful of those that already said to me, this is about creativity. So, for example, organisational resilience is impacted by the culture, visibility and performance of senior business leaders. We're going to talk about leaders in their role in enhancing creativity throughout their organisation. Shared values, behaviours, trust and engaged employees. That's also relevant to creativity. Quality of information and particularly knowledge sharing. Absolutely embedded in the creative process, encouraging and promoting innovation. Obviously, innovation and creativity very, very closely linked. And about identifying change and uncertainty and to take swift and effective action. So it's imagining what that change could be, imagining what that uncertainty might entail. So those are statements that relate to resilience that I would say are absolutely directly linked with the creative process. So one of the things that we explored in our research was, if employers think creativity is really important, how are they developing their people to be creative? So we asked about training experience in creative thinking. So we asked whether they could train people to be creative, whether they thought that was an accurate statement, and whether a person's creativity could be improved. As in lots of questionnaires, you ask similar questions in slightly different ways at different points throughout the questionnaire, just to see if you get some consistency. So if we look here at the turquoise bars on the chart, that's a response to the statement, we can train people to be creative. So if you look at the first 3 columns, there's a very strong indication from strongly agree to slightly agree that we can train people to be creative. So that's got the word training in it. The next bar, the purple bar, was the statement a person's creativity can be improved. So there's actually much stronger agreement for that. So maybe that implies a level of informality or experience rather than active training. So there we have it. We need creativity and we can train people to be more creative. So then we said, okay, how much training have you had on creativity in the last 5 years. And we gave them a number of options from none, 1 day, 2 to 7 days, etc. And this is what the responses showed, that 51% of the respondents had no creativity training in the last 5 years, and a further 12% had a day's creativity training in the last 5 years. 37% had more than 2 days. But what is absolutely astonishing is the percentage of people who have had no creativity training. So there's a discrepancy there between what we say we need and how we're actually preparing people to exercise that creativity that we need. Now, in terms of, well, should we? Why should we train people? Well, firstly, that big question is because we've said we need people to be creative, and like many skills, they need refreshing. But also, in terms of, I will talk you through this slide. How desirable is training in creative skills and the processes of creativity? So if you engage people in training and development on this, it can help to break down resistance and help to change behavior. Now, many of the skills on that second bullet point there that relate to creativity training are also the kind of skills that would be good in any team-based situation. You need clear goals, time management, you need people to listen, be assertive and supportive in their communication, etc. So there's an overlap there between any kind of teamwork and creative teamwork that we might engage in. But more specific kind of skills that we can be training people in, or attitudes that we could be trying to change through training and development that specifically relate to creativity, are this last group of skills. A belief in the value of diversity. We're going to have a chat about diversity in a moment. Openness to experience. Divergent, convergent, and associative thinking. So divergent is that kind of thinking where you try and generate as many ideas as possible. Convergent is where you bring things together and try and find some resolution. And associative thinking is how you make connections between people. Developing an exploratory mindset. So actively helping people to develop that exploratory mindset. Training people in how to evaluate ideas positively, and in perspective taking and a willingness to change perspectives. So there are a particular set of skills that are very, very closely related to creative thinking. So we can all ask ourselves in our own organizations, to what extent are we proactively bringing about people's developments in these areas? Okay, so if we skip back to our research that we did in this area, let's just have a quick look at the next piece of research, and then I will come back and have a look at whether we've got any comments in the comment box and respond to those. So this next piece of research, so we can see, didn't score quite so highly on the training that's going on in organisations around creativity. So we asked about whether there are mechanisms in place in the organisation to identify creativity, to recognise that it's happening, and to reward creative behaviour. So these are the responses we had here. So let's talk us through this. So I've used a sort of red, amber, green kind of coding. So if we look at the first statement, creativity is clearly defined in the context of my organisation. So quite a strong disagreement. But if you look at the neutral bars, which are actually the highest bar in all of these, that's the area I clumped together the slightly agree, neither agree nor disagree, and the slightly disagree. So people not having a strong view either way. And the second comment, my organisations has mechanisms in place to identify creativity. Again, fairly strong disagreement, but very strong, not sure, or maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. And the third comment, my organisation has mechanisms in place to reward creativity. Again, really not very strong agreement on any of these factors about we know what we mean by creativity in the context of the organisation. We've got mechanisms that identify it, and we've got mechanisms that reward it. Really not very strong showing in terms of the responses there. So I thought, well, maybe those are fairly formal. They're about defining something, having mechanisms, etc. Maybe things are not quite as bad as we think they are. So there were added a couple of other statements to these three. The next graph shows us a couple of the other statements. So if we look towards the two bars on the right-hand side, the first three bars represent the previous graph in a different format. But the last two bars, creativity is rewarded in my organisation. So not that it has mechanisms to reward, but that it's rewarded. So there, actually, we've got more agreement on that one. Still quite a lot of neutral, but we've got a bit more agreement on the green bar. And the final one, staff are allowed to express their creativity in my organisation. Again, that's really reassuring to see that we've got that big chunk of green there to say, yes, that's actually happening. So quite a lot of ability to express, but far less in terms of formal processes that might send the message, we are really serious about this. We need creativity and we need you to be creative. So I'm just going to finally give you just a few more statements from the questionnaire. Risk-taking is very, very closely associated with creativity. So again, whether it's rewarded in the organisation, the disagrees and the neutrals strongly outweigh the agreements. My organisation is tolerant of failure because being creative and thinking of different ways of doing things can bring with it, well, some of these ideas just don't work. So again, we don't have organisations being terribly tolerant of failure, or in the next one, tolerant of risk-taking. Disruptive thinking. Again, if we're going to be creative, sometimes we're going to be breaking the status quo, and that will be disruptive. So again, that one of all of them, respondents are just not comfortable with or organisations appear not to be comfortable with disruptive thinking. But if we look at the last bar, the bottom bar there, we've got a much stronger agreement for the fact that we need disruptive thinking. So we need disruptive thinking. However, whether it's encouraged in our organisations, that's much more questionable. Okay, I'm just going to pause there for a moment and let's have a quick look at the comment bars. Hello, Howard. We've got a question for you there. Does employers' emphasis on creativity mean they don't really know what their companies should be doing? Well, I think, obviously, I've moved on a bit. I can see the time you posted that comment. I think what the research is showing up is some contradictions, that we know what we need, but it's not actually happening. I should say actually that over 60% of the respondents to the questionnaire were in middle or senior management. So these were people who had influence over what could happen in an organisation, but they're also saying, not really, we're not really being overt and proactive about creative thinking, even though we say that we need it. But what I'm going to go on to in the next part of the presentation is to look at some of the things that we can pay attention to specifically to try and encourage this creative thinking. So one part of the questionnaire looked at what do people think creativity is. You know, sometimes it's such a huge concept, we don't know where should we start. You know, people tend to think of, the first thing they'll think of is, well, let's have a brainstorming. And often those don't always run as well as they should, because people then start rationalizing the suggestions before they should, if you like. They start closing things down before they've actually opened up all of the possible ideas. So we broke down, we took from all of the research that's been done on creativity and looked at a lot of the concepts and looked at whether our respondents thought they were or were not indicative of creative thinking. So let's have a look at what they thought were the most important factors in creativity. And then we can say, well, actually, we can do something about that. That's manageable. Okay, so the first factor is they agree that creativity is about mixing with people who are different to ourselves. Now, that 49% I've put in the bracket there is a net strongly agree. So I deducted all of the people who disagreed, were neutral about it, and we're still left with 49% over and above that balancing out, who thought that it was about mixing people. So we can do something about that in our organizations. We can deliberately mix people up to try and encourage creative thinking. And I'll talk a bit about diversity in a few moments' time. So the next point that came out, again, these are all net figures, was questioning assumptions. Now, I know myself that across higher education, we do a lot of probing and questioning, because that's what we're all about. That's part of our role in society, to push the boundaries. But could I really say, actually, when was the last time somebody sat you down and said, I want you to question these assumptions. I want you to surface what the assumptions are in this, and I want us to deliberately question them. So assumptions, if we think of a business context, assumptions that we want to increase our market share. You know, people take that as a given in many cases, but are we just living with that as an assumption? And actually, there may be a different measure that would be much more relevant. So that actively getting people to question assumptions will lead us to more creative thinking. Going beyond boundaries, here we've got even stronger agreement that this is what creative thinking is about. So this is a bit of mixing with people who are different to ourselves, but it's also very specifically looking at the boundaries that we work within. So those boundaries could be regulatory boundaries, they could be structural boundaries, they could be functional boundaries, they could be sectoral boundaries, but pushing beyond those boundaries. So obviously a starting point in that is recognizing what those boundaries are, and then saying, actually, we're going to step over that and we're going to go beyond this. Then we had thinking flexibly. So very, very strong agreement that creativity is about thinking flexibly, which is wonderful, because that's something we can easily do. And actually, if you think about this, these are all things we can do without necessarily adding any costs to our operations whatsoever. These are easy things that we can do to increase our creative thinking. And the final point there is that people agreed that creativity does mean different things in different contexts. So maybe within our organizations made up of different processes, different functions, etc., different geographical sites, that we need to explore what creativity might mean there, and give it that scope, and mix people up and question the assumptions, etc. So there are some very concrete things we can be doing at little or no cost at all to increase our creative thinking. Okay, let me just pause there 1 second. Hello, Katie. Interesting to note that in my experience of working with large corporate organisations, creative is often only acceptable as a leadership skill when partnered with problem solving. That's a very astute observation, actually, Katie. But if you think about it, if you go back to the creativity has to be useful, so it's absolutely closely tied with problem solving. But again, problem solving is a huge concept in itself. You know, you could say every time our brain makes a decision to do something that's not routine, that's solving a problem. We've made a decision how to approach something. So I think once we get this idea of creative thinking, you know, we all need to be doing it. And if people are focusing it on only senior leaders, then they're missing a lot of golden opportunities to really embrace the potential that creative thinking can bring. And Howard, you said, is there any sense from your research that creativity is seen as a skill more for higher levels? Oh, that's interesting. Or across the whole organisation? Yes, there was a part of our research that we did ask about new graduates, because obviously as educators, we need to, a part of the reason for doing this as well was to look at what can we do, what are we doing right or wrong in terms of the kinds of people that we are helping to develop to go out into the workplace. So we did ask, and there was, I haven't given the statistics in this particular presentation, but there was very definitely a desire for creativity in younger people coming into the organisation, particularly in graduates. And again, unfortunately, that employers weren't seeing it in the graduates they were recruiting. But another contradiction is they also weren't using it in their recruitment process in terms of rating the people they were employing. They were actively not looking for creativity, and yet they were saying they weren't getting it in the graduates. So lots of wonderful contradictions that give us all the opportunity to do something differently. Okay, let's move on to the next section. And what I wanted to just look at in a little more detail was about team creativity, because often this creativity is happening with other people. Of course, there are people who do creative jobs by themselves, but in the vast majority of cases, we're working as part of a team. So let's have a little look at team creativity. Now, this is taken initially from literature that's out there, research that has been out there. And there are some key concepts that influence a team's creativity. They are the diversity of the team, the climate, the environment within the team and directly associated with it, having effective creativity processes, the cultivation of skills, which we've addressed in the previous section, and leaders. Now, let's just have a very quick look at each of those in turn. Diversity. So diversity overwhelmingly is found to be a positive thing in engendering creative thinking. So diversity can be age, gender, occupation, knowledge, skills, background, geography, but even within that geography, different cultures within that geography. So there's also been research done on culture itself. There's a huge body of research on culture and how it affects attitudes to hierarchy, power, status, authority. We all know those play out in team environments, tradition, social practices, etc. to uncertainty, whether people embrace uncertainty or really whether they do their absolute best to try and avoid uncertainty. What's valued in cultures? Is it competitiveness? Is it cooperation? And gratification of individuals? You know, do people deserve rewards for on a regular basis, etc.? So all of those come into the element of a diversity within a team that's working on some problem solving and trying to bring about creative thinking in that. And there are contextual influences within each of these areas of diversity, if you like. And just on that last point, it's really quite interesting, because diversity, as I say, is overwhelmingly a good thing. However, research has shown that occasionally it can be disruptive and counterproductive. So it needs to be actively worked with. And what it says is that generally diversity is very good at divergent thinking when we're trying to get those ideas together. But it can, if we're not very careful, act against us when it comes to that convergent thinking, when we need to bring it all back together. So diversity on the whole is something that we need to bring about in our teams if we wish them to be more creative. Okay, then there's the importance of the climate or the environment. A little piece from the research there. If we look at the bottom bar, this is again net agreement and strong agreement. People are more likely to take risks, closely associated with creative thinking, when their environment is supportive. So strong agreement that we need to give people freedom and somehow take away the fear of risk from the environment. So the characteristics of a supportive environment: it needs to be inclusive, it needs to be where people are willing to explore their differences. And a large part of the writing on creative thinking is about creative thinking in teams, is about we need to give the team time to get to know each other, to look at each other's perspectives, to understand the expertise that they've got there, and to try and build trust. So a supportive climate is also where people are actually motivated by each other's efforts, where there's a sharing of ideas and people engage in constructive debate. We could say, well, actually, yes, this all makes sense. But I think the key difference here is about that willingness to embrace and explore difference. But also important is that there is active support for creativity, not just passive support, but active support for creativity and for risk-taking. And where we tolerate mistakes and members are willing to show themselves to be vulnerable because they know their ideas will not be negatively received, because they trust the intentions of the other people within the team, so that what we call psychological risk is really reduced. So again, we can look at our own practices within our organisations and look at the extent to which we create a supportive climate within various teams that will encourage that creative thinking. Okay, there's also particular processes that are related to team creativity, well, some of them, as we say, that they would overlap with what we would say would be desirable teamwork anyway, that inspiration to stretch people and to stretch their goals, organisation and coordinating the contributions and providing feedback, individualised consideration, so really bringing out those different ideas and appreciating them, and the team information processing. So this is where actually we say that sharing information is not enough. It has to be what we call information elaboration. So it's about that building and expanding upon that idea. So that's where, again, we can be proactive within our teams and we can bring out the nuances, we can bring out the complexity by building upon the ideas that people surface. Okay, let me just have a quick check in the comments box on that. Howard, your comment about interesting that there was no mention of knowledge and experience as drivers of good creativity. Do they have no value in making creative activity more productive? Actually, they do, Howard. We did ask about whether it was perceived that creativity was the province of the young, and people disagreed. Fortunately, people disagreed with that. There were statements about whether people needed expertise in their field in order to be creative. What I brought out in this presentation were those factors that had the strongest agreement. So the things, there was more evenly balanced agreement and disagreement about whether you needed that expertise in your field in order to be creative, or whether actually that, if you like, that naivety could actually bring about creativity. And that was an area where there was much more closeness between those agreements and those disagreements. But it's an absolutely valid question. But what I say is heartening is that at least most people disagreed that it was only young people who could be creative. Okay, I just want to move now on to the last element of those team creativity processes, and that's about leadership and creativity. So leaders are absolutely vital in bringing about this creative process, whether they are part of the team, and if you like, the acknowledged formal leader of that team, or whether they are outside the team and just have a sort of a supervisory reporting into role. But they can influence it by making sure that people are given the time for this socialization process, to take different perspectives, to understand the expertise that's there, so that we can reduce the bias and the stereotyping that is going on, or that could potentially go on within that team. Could I just say as well that there's creativity research on virtual teams, and everything that is written here applies equally as well to teams that operate across several sites, several countries, etc. So we can take that into account. So leaders can see what gaps there are in the knowledge, and make sure that everybody understands the expertise that is there within the team available. They can make sure there's diversity there and a balance of inputs, and they can encourage the development of external networks, because of course, depending on the nature of the problem that the team is trying to address, it's highly likely that external networks are going to be a source of support, research, extra knowledge, somewhere to bounce ideas off, etc. So leaders can really influence that. They are the ones who can encourage that climate that's open to change and error friendly, and promote divergent thinking, constructive debate, and make sure that people do constructively look at each other's contributions. They can also recognise any training and development needs and provide the resources that are needed, and they can devise incentives, group or individual, and openly recognise creative attempts. Just on that note, in the literature, actually, it is very divided about the power of incentives in bringing about creative thinking. So finally, just a quick look at what were considered to be the positive and negative leadership behaviours. This is an actual experiment that was done over a 6-month period with people keeping diaries. And from that, textual analysis was done. And these conclusions were drawn about positive and negative behaviours from leaders. So leaders, in terms of positive behaviour, they're positive in that they foster the flow of information from the group. out to the external environment of the organization and beyond, into the team and across the team. So that gives an ongoing understanding of what is working. Positive leadership behaviors where they openly recognize contributions, consult with team members and are receptive to their ideas. In the top right-hand corner, they use organizational and external networks to reinforce the value of the project and to bring back helpful information to the team. So this came across very strongly about the leaders representing the project and championing it to people outside the project as being really important, and showing empathy for subordinates' feelings and concerns. And the negative leadership behaviors, failure to consult teams, if I just run down the left-hand side here, lack of regard for the capability or other responsibilities of subordinates, lack of clarity in task assignment, micromanaging, and monitoring people unfairly. And on the right-hand side, a failure to challenge external views of the project. So not defending it, if you like, and not explaining it to external parties was seen as being very negative. And dealing inadequately with problems, either personal problems or technical problems. And it's no surprise, I think, to say that it was also found that those negative leadership behaviours had much more impact upon people in the team than the positive behaviours. Okay, so just to summarise then, we've had a very brief look in these 45 minutes at the growing importance of creativity and how it does very strongly overlap with resilience. We've looked at how it's interpreted both in the literature and where employers agree with those interpretations. We've looked at whether it is or isn't, unfortunately, recognised, encouraged and rewarded. And we have found lots of contradictions there about the espoused need for creativity and what appears to be actually happening in terms of recruitment, training, and then what actually goes on within the organisations. And through looking at those elements that make up creativity, about going across boundaries, challenging assumptions, paying attention to diversity, to the climate, to the kind of leadership we exercise, those are all things that we can actively take and do something with in order to increase our creative thinking and our resilience. And I just want to leave you with one final thought from somebody you may have heard of. Creativity is intelligence having fun. Okay. And lovely. My email is there. I would be very happy to receive any emails from you if you have any thoughts, any further questions, and anything that comes up on Facebook, etc. I will be very happy to respond to. So thank you very much for listening in. And I hope that you found that useful and that there are things that you can go away and think about within your own organisations. Thanks very much.